welcome everyone to our Big Ideas California Countercultures course. And most of you who are here today know the drill. So it's thinking through the arts at Berkeley, and we're co-teaching, Professor Cohen and I, this gateway course in the humanities, letters, and sciences. And thank you to Sean and to everybody else who has been involved with the course now for 10 weeks. This week is feminism, the week we're talking about feminisms and public and social practices. And our guest speaker today, delighted to introduce her. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that we had a big sort of sweeping course on the 60s and 70s and feminism and feminist art on Monday. So the students have a lot of information and context for today's class, but we're really looking forward to getting deeper into the material today with our speaker. Laura Eliza Pérez is a professor here in the Department of Ethnic Studies and a member of the doctoral program in Performance Studies. And she is also affiliated in the Department of Women's Studies and the Center for Latin American Studies, which is exciting because we've been talking about the intersections of all of these different types of discourses with the students, so very excited. Professor Pérez received her PhD from Harvard University and a BA-MA joint degree from the University of Chicago. Pérez curated UC Berkeley's first Latino performance art series, co-curated Chicana Badgirls. Oh, you did, that's you. Yeah, Las Hociconas in 2009 in Albuquerque, and curated labor art and labor artorio, right? Bay Area Latina art at the Richmond Art Center, if those of you have seen it, a really wonderful show, in 2011. Pérez is the author of Chicana Art, The Politics of Spiritual and Aesthetic Altarities from Duke University Press, 2007, now going into its second printing. And her new book, and I'm looking forward to you talking a little bit about this today, Area Ideologies, Writing on Art, Spirituality, and the Decolonial, will be published by Duke University in coming up in 2017 or 2018. Pérez is at work on another research project on women of color and nonviolence, and is editing an anthology as well on the work of multimedia artist Consuela Jimenez Underwood. This summer, this is an exciting project. Can I be one of your students? As an American Cultures Engaged Scholarship awarded course, Pérez will be teaching US women of color through the arts a 6 weeks course with an internship component at different types of arts organizations in the Bay Area, which makes me think a lot about the way that we've been envisaging our class here as a kind of gateway course to multiple venues on campus and beyond. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Pérez to all of you. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Natasha and Professor Cohen, and thank all of you for being here as well, for not skipping class and for showing up on this dry day. I'm happy to be here with you talking about Ana Mendieta's work in the context of the course that you've been taking, Countercultures of California, and also in the context of the museums this museum, the Berkeley Art Museum's having hosted a wonderful exhibition in the fall and that went into the early winter, right, or rather late winter that went into February, the Ana Mendieta show of films, which has rarely been seen and is only at the beginning of its touring. There's a great deal of work. So the films have been a great project that Mendieta's niece, Raquel Cecilia Mendieta, has worked on and is producing documentaries from. But if you read the scholarship one thing that we're told by even very recent essays is that there is a really huge archive that is still unknown of Ana Mendieta's work. So that's going to be incredibly exciting. Ana Mendieta is probably one of the better known of US Latina artists, even for that matter, Latin American artists. Maybe after Frida Kahlo, right? These things shift and change. And so she has uh, begun, I think, to get more attention. You know, to say that she is one of the better known Latina artists certainly doesn't mean that, you know, she has the kind of audiences yet that, you know, we anticipate that she will have. But it does raise, I think, the wonderful question of what is so powerful and compelling about her work, right? In the same way that we ask that about Kahlo's work when we see it, you know, continually being shown throughout the world, and exciting for people that see it not only for the first time, but, you know, the first few times. So Ana Mendieta's work is very much like that. It has that compelling quality that maybe by way of introduction, I can say something a little bit astrological that sort of helps me kind of, you know, focus on the core of some of the things that interest her. She was born November 17th, 1948, which those of you who follow your horoscopes and other horoscopes, yes, will know that that is a Scorpio. Scorpio rules matters that have to do with birth, death, and regeneration. So, regardless of whether or not we think astrology is funny or insane, it's still in the case of Mendieta, it's a really nice little kind of rubric, right? Birth, death, regeneration. These were certainly, for whatever reason, right? These were certainly like core themes that you see in her work. And it could be that because of these kinds of meditations, as well as her engagement with nature, that her work continues, and I think will continue to be super resonant. But I'll return, you know, to these themes, especially when I show you specific pieces. And I'll also talk about her death because she died very young at 36, but was able to, in the first half of the 80s, she died in 1985. In the first half of the 80s, she was able to achieve quite a lot of success for a young artist and was able to teach in many art programs, was received several prestigious prizes, including the Rome Prize, which allowed her to spend a year at the American Academy of Art in Rome and allowed her to make a really huge leap in her work and exposed her, I think, to a lot more art when she was able to travel throughout Europe while being there. And so I'll return to you know, the death, because I think that it's an ongoing, I think, important question when we think about women and culture in general, and not just women in art. So we'll talk about that. I will arrive at this point. So the way that I've framed what I want to share with you today, there's so many ways that we could approach it, but the way that I've framed it is by thinking about decoloniality in her work, especially through her use of nature, as I said, but also in her own insistence on thinking about much of her work, especially the work that she's most well known for, her siluetas, her silhouettes, her own insistence that these works were self-portraiture. So I think that's super interesting because it kind of puts us right in the middle of a lot of sensitivities and controversies, right, around identity, around self-representation, around, you know, what type of media is best, right, at different historical moments. And her moment, self-representation, as in self-portraiture, was not so interesting. It didn't seem to be so interesting. And the 80s and the 90s didn't make it more so. But part of what I want to argue or suggest to you is that in her case, thinking about representing the self is an incredibly important thing, and she's not alone in that. It's a generational thing. Other women artists, queer artists, artists of color, right, that is, artists who are negatively racialized, were also making different kinds of decision than mainstream artists, even mainstream avant-garde artists, so making different kinds of choices around what it meant to think about themselves as social beings, what it meant to try to represent the self in the face of how the negatively racialized, negatively gendered self was already being represented. So I think that her work really does allow us to think about some of these questions about, well, does it need to be labeled, right? Does it need to be labeled as feminist? Does it need to be labeled of color? Is it, is it art about identity politics? Is it art that is essentialist? So again, I'll talk a little bit more about these things, especially as I move on and talk about particular pieces. But I think it's intriguing that she herself, towards the end of her life, said that she didn't think of her work, she didn't identify her work with either modernism or postmodernism, which was already, in the air. And so I think that that's very interesting. Why didn't she think of her work as postmodernist, right? And I guess part of what I'm suggesting to you through the Decolonial is that while there may be many aspects, many concerns, right? Many politics, even like aesthetic politics, politics of how to make art, that are shared with postmodern artists or post-colonial artists or other kinds of, artists. What I want to suggest is that that the question of social identity, of individual identity, of identity as a woman, right? That these are things that she absolutely is concerned about. She's active in women's galleries and in third world women's and in people of color and African diasporic, organizations. So these are things that she's very interested. But the work itself, I think, does explore, I think, more the question of what it is to be human, right? And what the relationship of the human is to nature. And this is what I'm calling part of what is also a globalized, in the West and also in the third world, a globalized movement of anti-colonial and decolonial thought, right? And so that may seem a little far-fetched. How so? And in Mendieta's work, as in many other artists of color in the United States, artists that identify with their indigenous Native American ancestry or their African diasporic ancestry, there is a study and an interest in the non-Western, right? There is an exploration of, we could say, the art histories, the meaning of making what in the West we call art, the role of what in the West we call artist. And so I think that, many of the quotes that people are familiar with, and I hope to be able to read some of them to you, remark on things like her belief that that there was a cosmic sap, like those are her words, that there was a cosmic sap that connected all of life on the planet and beyond, right? And so for feminist critics, art critics, who are concerned with her not being viewed as believing that all women are the same because they have ultimately the same bodies, right? The same kinds of, organisms, genitalia. So they worry about this, that feminism, early feminism, might have gotten trapped by this response to patriarchy of like, okay, if you have a male-centered language, we can dig up and create a woman-centered language. If you think things are phallic and you see the phallic everywhere and you talk about the seminal, right, and make references to male bodies and male experiences, we can do the same, right? We can talk about ovaries, we can talk about menstrual blood, we can start mapping the female body as well, right? And so even while there's a lot of truth in that critique, I think, of male-centered or phallo-logocentric, as Lucy Rigaray has, I think, very neatly, packaged phallo, right? Phallus, logos, word, centric, centered, so language, word, centered around a male worldview, right? Even though I think that's really like, I think that Irigaray's and other feminists, early feminist criticism, that we need to bring more of the experience of women and, let's say, non-hetero, today we would say also like non-heterosexual, heteronormative men, that needs to be reflected in our language too. It can lead to this kind of biological essentialism. That's the worry, right? That ultimately we will pit, in binary thought, male bodies and female bodies. Where would that leave trans bodies? Where would that leave queer bodies, right? Is one immediate kind of critique. But, there's also the critique that simply because, we have certain kinds of organs, it doesn't determine, we don't believe, right? I think today, and many people then didn't believe that it determined a great deal, right? It meant we had the capacity to do certain things, and might need help to do other things if we wanted to imitate each other, right? But so this cosmic sap idea, however, I don't think is the same kind of essentialism as arguing that ultimately all women, right, share something that is core, just as all men share something that is core. I mean, I'm not actually so much interested in that question when I think about Mendieta as I am because of her work, in her really thinking about the relationship between humans and nature. I think a lot of her work is really examines that relationship in both directions, right? What does it mean to be a part of nature? Are we a part of nature? What does it mean as process, right? Being, the verb, the gerund that marks ongoing experience, right? It's not a finalized act. It's not a final verb. It's not a past tense. It's not a future. It's an ongoing present. And as an ongoing present, it's also alive. It's about what happens in real time, which is transformation, right? And so transformation is so core, back to the Scorpio, right, little stickum. Transformation is so core in her work, in leaving work out, in doing work in nature and leaving work out in nature. She called the work that she did from the early 70s through, through the time of her death, she called the body of the work earthworks, which I think is interesting too, because she was like coining, right, like a new term. And earthworks, whether she did it with a slash or whether she did it with a dash, it's signaling, right, this hybridity, right, this search through different media to kind of express something that can't be sort of tidily accessed by saying, well, this is performance art, this is sculpture, right? This is a documentary photograph or a documentary film or video, or this is conceptual work, right? Or this is environmental sculpture or work. Earthworks. There's something when you look at the body of her work. There's something that is really clear, and that is to me like how experimental her work was. She documented her work, it seems, very carefully and in a very detailed way. And often it's really, it may seem really monotonous because it is a looking very carefully at what happens when something is put in time, right? And then some pieces she's left and they still exist, like some of the sculptures she made on the caves in Cuba. So anyway, enough of talking without moving the pictures. I just wanted to kind of put out a few ideas. I'll talk more as I'm showing some of the slides, not all of them. But I did want to put out, to kind of give you that heads up about thinking about the way in which the siluetas and other forms are working and where they're happening. And well, I'll comment a bit. So her early if you Google her like on Wiki or just even open up any exhibition catalog, we usually have the story, her biography, which highlights a few things that I think are really important to know, and in part because she also highlighted them when she wrote or talked about her life. And one of those things is that I said she was born in 1948. Well, in 1961, because of the rise of of a new Cuban government, right, with Castro at the head and the overthrow of Batista, her father, who was involved in some of these activities, when he realized that there was a growing alliance between Castro's government and the USSR, began to be involved in a counter, speaking of counter, right, in a counter revolutionary movement. And so he was jailed. He was in jail for quite a long time. Ana Mendieta didn't see him for 18 years or so. But there was a program that was concocted between the Catholic Church and the CIA, and it was called the Peter Pan program. And thousands and thousands of Cuban children were sent throughout the United States to different parts of the country to, hopefully, ostensibly, to good foster homes. Ana Mendieta came from a very solid middle-class family with professionals. One of her great-grandfathers, I believe, one of her relatives was a general. So it's a family that was also recognized for its patriotism, its nationalism. It was distinguished in many ways. And so the idea was that they would be sent to homes that would be similar, right, and that it would be temporary. That was the hope. But in fact, what happened is that when she arrived at the age of 12, and her sister was 3 years older, she came with her older sister Raquel. What she experienced was very traumatic, because suddenly she was seen and treated as a person of color. She was called black, right? But using the N-word. She was also, she recounts these things, and so they appear over and over. She was also called whore, slut, because she was a woman, a child, a tween, right? A tween of color. And her sister remarks on how this was a really difficult experience for her, and it really shaped her, and it made her aware of racialization. And I'll add the gendering of racialization, the way in which females of color experience racism in a way that is specifically gendered. So that, I think, that's an important element, I think, to think about, as is simply the question of exile, which is something that she also continually spoke about and thought about exile. In her work, you'll see that exile is referring in a literal way, right, to exile, like in some of the later pieces we'll see, like Oshun, that are about a relationship between Cuba and the U.S., or Isla, island, making a very kind of specific reference to Cuba and not being there, right? Or, for those who know that biographical detail. For those who don't, you read those pieces differently, I think. But exile becomes like a much larger theme, like a metaphor for, I think, like more existential questions, right? Exile from what, right? The human condition. Many people, many artists, many writers, many philosophers, right, have written about, and psychologists, right? This sense of the human as fundamentally orphan, right? So exile. Displacement, right? Sense of homelessness. These are some of the things that are part of her biographical experience. So she's held in a refugee camp with her sister when she comes, and then she is bounced back and forth between foster homes and orphanages. and I think, well, at least one orphanage. I can't say plural. And recently, I read a little bit more about the why of that bouncing. And it seems that that bouncing had to do with racialization again, because Ana was dark. Ana was not European looking, and so this is an extended experience then throughout her childhood. So she, however, as her sister recounts, once she discovered art and that art was what she wanted to do, it became like an incredibly like a positive experience for her. And it's very striking how she will work with her body quite a lot at the beginning, with that brown body of hers, that female brown body, that nude female brown body of herself, in a way that is, I think, kind of wonderful, because it's not necessarily about that brown body being female, but we are seeing this body. And so that also raises questions for us that we can think about and talk about like the uses of nudity when women engage it. And we want to ask ourselves, when women engage it, is there a difference in the way that, and I would say this question will vary in historical period. So in the case of Mendieta, to be concrete, is it useful for us to think about the use of the nude body for a negatively racialized woman? Because that racialization happens through your body, right? The perception of whether your body is first world or third world, right? So anyway, that was all kind of triggered by looking at this first slide. So in 1972, 74 is when she's, this is still very, very early in her career as a young artist. She experiments with manipulation of her appearance, right? And so we have photos of her like smashing her face against the mirror, gluing, she has documentation of gluing, beard, hair, facial hair on. And in this piece, working with like the different self-representations through masking, manipulating, the flesh. 72, she's also making early performance pieces, and also making some of her earliest filmings of performances. And this is also, it's pointed out by some of the scholars, that this is one of the first performances where she begins to work with blood, which becomes an important component in her work. I mentioned the decolonial, and I mentioned non-Western art histories, non-Western approaches to what is art, what is the artist, but there's also non-Western approaches to the materials themselves. What do you use? What does it mean to use? So she uses blood, she'll use milk, she'll use fresh water and salt seawater, and many other things that you'll see in these pieces. But blood, in many traditions, but certainly in the Afro-diasporic Cuban and Caribbean tradition of Santeria, blood is one of the special carriers, along with body fluids like semen, right? And it's one of the special carriers of concentrated life energy, right? Ashe. It's a kind of like chi, right? There are in different cultures, there are different languages for what is understood as a vital, like living force or energy. It's an energy of constant movement. And it's also what connects all of life. So I think that's a really important thing to think about when we think about how she uses natural fluids and materials, right? And also the body, right? What does it mean for her to begin exploring blood from an increasingly Afro-diasporic perspective? So this is, again, like more of this work. She used a model to do this piece, but she also used herself. She covered whether the model or herself, or the friend, right, or herself with either chicken feathers or turkey feathers and some kind of adhesive. In other pieces, she used blood, and does to some degree some kinds of performances as a sort of a bird creature. I'm kind of reminded of Lop Lop, right? I'm kind of reminded of like surrealism and the fascination with transformational beings, right? Sort of were creatures, right? There's something about there's some fascination in surrealism, as you probably know, with the non-Western as well, but also the Western has traditions of the shamanic, right? Altered states of experience, right? It's a way of, among many things that we can think of when we think about surrealism, you know, and actually those early avant-garde movements, right? Dadaism, Futurism, uh, those movements were interested in exploring the limits of art forms. That's very clear when you think about something like Cubism, right? The limits of representation, but also like the limits of performance and critique, right? Of not only the art forms, but more importantly, of society, right? These are like pre-World War, inter-World War, and post-World War II movements. And so that's kind of signature, whether those movements were right-wing, like the, and I put out my left hand, like the Futurists, or whether they were left-wing. I might as well balance it. And so I think there is something of that fascination, of that energy with, if not this, then something else. You know, if not this, how can we transcend this? Some kind of alternative state of being, some kind of alternative consciousness, some kind of alternative to the forms of rationalization that have created war and mass destruction and brutality and genocide, right? So this profound disenchantment with the logic of enlightenment, right, with the deification of a scientifism in a form of rationalism that can excuse and explain mass destruction. I see a similar kind of energy in Mendieta's work, and she was familiar with those traditions and with contemporary art movements and artists who continued to explore in that surrealistic vein the alternative as a critique to the assumed and the normatized. This is one of the kind of early Silueta experiments as well. She was teaching in the late 60s and the early 70s, and there are these videos that she took of her children, her class that were children, and she would have them do different things. Like she would have them, like they were like a little laboratory, it seems, for her, of things she was learning in her own classes. She would have the children moving, you know, or she would have the children hiding under objects. And I kind of see that she's continuing in these early pieces this idea of exploring, you know, the body and movement. In this case, in the environment, right, of the outdoors, and then kind of beginning to mix it up a little bit, right? There are other pieces where the body is almost completely covered and it looks like a lump, a big, I will say a big unusual lump, because it doesn't look like a hilly lump, you know? And so you'll see this kind of exploration, right, of body, and I said that's very experimental, right? This of body and other materials that are not body. Um, this is, I want to move quickly through these pieces. Um, so um, the two pieces that I quickly showed were also early pieces that Mendieta did. And they were pieces, she did, I think, 3 pieces that had to do with a rape that happened on campus at the University of Iowa, where she got her degrees in art and art practice. And to me, it's very powerful, speaking of feminism. You know, what does it mean to be a woman artist for her at this time in this specific place, her campus? And much like what we are still experiencing on US campuses, right? Where it's only recently that we have an app like Nixie that tells us where crimes are occurring. I find that really valuable because you find that violent crimes against women happen throughout the day, even in well-lit spaces. And along with the military today, along with the military, which we might be surprised, college campuses have very, very high rates of sexual assault against women, right? And so what she did in her moment in 1973 was to make these pieces. And I like the way she used what she was learning at that time, happenings, performance art, inviting people to come for a piece at her apartment. How cool, how exciting, we're going out, right? And then, you are confronted with this really, this recreation of that, where she tried to follow in one of the cases, the one that was in the apartment versus the outdoor piece, where she tried to recreate the scene of the crime, of the assault, and and the other piece that she did was not a piece where she invited people, but rather she did it in nature, and it also had a female body, and again she used blood. And she said about, and then she has another piece. Sorry, I'm beating this thing. I want to apologize to it. She had another piece that involved some sort of crime had happened, bloodied mattresses and blood on the walls, etc. And she said about these pieces that she didn't know if what she was doing was the right thing to do in response or the wrong thing to do about these horrible crimes, but that it's what she felt she had to do. And I think we can talk about it, as well, if you like, when I finish showing pieces. But to me already what I'm seeing is like this like broad, like she's following this interest in blood, right, and the power of blood from so many different perspectives. Right now, not so much what we might say like a more philosophical kind of thinking of the ashe of blood, but it may be even something more practical. If blood is something that is sacred, even if you're an atheist, right, we can say blood is sacred because human life is so important, right, and we use sacred as a metaphor. But if you are in any form or way religious or spiritual, right, and you literally think that there is like sacredness in that, wow, to think about what crime means, and assaults against human beings and gendered, assaults in this way. So she continued her explorations of thinking about blood and people and society by doing this piece, which was a piece that she did at the Moffat building, where she was living. And she did this with the help of a friend and her sister. And she entered the building and poured out blood so that it absolutely looked like the blood was coming from the doorway, and then circled out of the building and climbed into a car. So if you were here and sat through the films that were here in the fall, you saw her. You saw the camera in the car and people in the car. And what they're doing is like fascinating, right? They were like documenting people's reactions. And so it's fascinating because you see all of this, like, these people that are, many of them are very young, they're students, they're wearing like really like cool 70s clothing. And, I don't know what we think about that, but so many just walk by. So does that mean like those bell bottoms, that like hippie culture, does that mean like, wow, I have to stop, what happened, my god, there's an accident? So it's so interesting. You ask yourself, especially from our moment in history, it's like, wow, so what did all of this, what did all of this politics of dress symbolize, signify? What was that about? As people just walk past, and some people even walk over and through. Now, there's also some lumps, which I believe are kind of entrail type things, and some people do stop and kind of walk around and look, and then in the end, it's cleaned up by the building's janitor. But it was a pretty interesting piece. This is also, again, this is still like that early work, very early work. She's in this piece. If you saw this film, it's really nice to see it as a film, because you're able to see how slow the process of the dripping of the blood is, and then you could tell that more blood has been added, because at some point it's dripping, more thickly and more quickly. And so it was a study of this blood dripping from a woman's face, which, as it turns out, is her own face. She used herself primarily in most of her work, not exclusively, but primarily. Many people have pointed out when writing about this piece that, it's just incredibly ambiguous. So some people, like, what are we to make of it? Well, I think, like with any piece, we can make so many things from it depending on what our interests are, right? or what happens to grab us, whether consciously or unconsciously. But in the context, for myself today, today, in the context of what I've already been sharing, thinking about, the context of those earlier pieces on violence, I can't help but to think of how that's part of the repertoire now. That's part of the colors in the box of Crayolas when we think about blood and association in her work. Here's another piece that she did, and the parenthetical, like, parts of the title are taken from her own markings, the way that she cataloged or marked her own records or files or boxes. This is also one of the earliest siluetas, so a silueta or a silhouette, right? We generally think of a silhouette like in the, maybe the cutouts of black paper, right? Or paintings that look like the cutouts of black paper, silhouettes. And in US cultural history, they were often done like as portraits of sitters. You might have profiles of individuals or families or couples or something like that. So, we think of the silueta sometimes in that very literal way. You'll see why as we see some of her other pieces, some of her earth body works, where what you're really looking at is primarily like a hollowed piece of earth, and maybe it's dark, and so you clearly see the relationship to that definition of a silhouette or a silueta. But this is also, the silhouette on her work seems, sometimes it had a body in it, sometimes it was a hollowed out form, sometimes it was a mounded form, sometimes it was a mounded form with like a trench built around it and covered with different objects. And those silhouettes happened in different media. And here, the media, I mean the matter. On earth, sand, right? Wet earth or mud, in the water, in the air, so in a variety of different, of different forms, right? Or materials. And so this one of the early ones, she has her notebooks, her sketches, many of those early pieces, and some of the older pieces. It definitely involves the use of a body, right? The body has to be present, and it's the outline. It's a body, a real body that we're looking at. We don't know if it's dead or alive, but it certainly is an identifiable human form. We identify it through its human form. And in this case, this was part of the work. This is also important in her formation because she studied already in the late 60s, if I remember correctly, at University of Iowa. She was taking courses in pre-Columbian culture. And she was studying indigenous cultures. And she had a prof who was a specialist in archaeology at a site in Mexico, Teotihuacan. And so she accompanied him as a student, enrolled and doing work on a dig. And while she was there, she explored ruins and worked with ruins, worked in ruins, and began making pieces in the ruins, or in the area of the ruins. And so this is one such piece, and she's covered herself with flowers, as you see. And so again, I go back to the life, death, rebirth, right? Whatever we may think when we look at this piece, and there's so many things we could think of, but certainly there's something there about this body that appears to be dead. We don't usually nap in this rigid form, right? So there's something there in that relationship, and yet the tension between like this rubble, these ruins, but also these flowers, right? These fresh flowers, is really interesting. I think very, very powerful. This is also, as you see, this is a piece that she also did in Mexico. There are some pieces with her under a sheet. Sometimes the sheet is just a blank. Sometimes she's sort of bundled into the sheet like a pre-Columbian glyph for death. She kind of ties herself up and is holding her knees. And other times she's laying out with a white sheet, blood covered, or a dark sheet, as you'll see, I believe, in at least one other piece. So these are some of, she did several pieces that, we already saw, one with the feathers. She did several pieces that involved feathers and blood and water. One of them is Bird Run and then Bird Run, Wash Up. I think I just mangled the name of the second one, but hopefully I'll actually get to the title later. And so again, this idea where she's like running, along the beach in the film, which is not this. This is a document in Bird Run. This is a piece that she did twice in two different takes, and they both involved taking blood from a container and like carefully covering her body with blood, and then after that kind of covering herself with feathers. She also did a version, or at least one version, where it's just covered with blood, and then eventually she will either go into the water and wash herself, or she will create another piece like floating in the water and have that photographed and documented. But this concern, right, with blood and in a way making the inside outside, right, kind of a visualizing of that is part of what I think comes to mind in these kinds of pieces, along with the other things that we've already talked about: violence, ashe. And again, I said to me, there's also a very kind of experimental quality. Okay, so here's some. Yeah, so 1974, she also filmed Ocean Bird. That was the right name, Ocean Bird Wash Up. And she did that in Oaxaca, running, right, kind of bird-like, running quickly along a beach and having that documented. In 1974, excuse me, she filmed several films along with Bird Run and Ocean Bird Wash Up. She also did a labyrinth, blood imprint, and a burial pyramid. Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you. How many of you have seen images of blood tracks? It's some of those images are some of the best known of her images. We've seen several of them on campus, and now appearing on people's books and being used again. She worked with blood and kind of writing with blood in a number of pieces. There's a piece where she walks onto stage. She has a container that she dips a brush into. Sometimes she's using her own sleeves, her own hands, rather than a brush. And she writes, "She got love in an alley," and it's dripping. She got love, right? So that, again, we can read that in the context of that moment and a kind of a feminist. How do we read the gendering of that? The blood, the dripping, the location, which is an alleyway. And she would study this work. She would study people passing by and their reaction to what was essentially a form of graffiti. But she made these body track images on various kinds of materials, various kinds of paper or cloth, and she even did them again towards the end of her life. But she did several of these experiments with blood writing at the beginning. Here's another early piece. I mentioned that she did the burial pyramid. That was one of the films that she did. Again, for those who saw the films, the burial pyramid begins, so this is a photograph where you can see her pretty clearly, but it begins with her covered more thoroughly with stones, and you're looking at the landscape and you're not quite sure what you're seeing, right? You see, again, some kind of lump. It looks like there might be something flesh covered, there, and it's only through this very exaggerated deep breathing that we begin, and the tumbling of the stones, that we begin to see that there's a body underneath. And so the heavy breathing continues, more of the stones fall off, and then she comes to an eventual rest again, where we cannot perceive the breathing. Very similar to the pieces that she did with grass, or pieces where she also was covered with mud, that are like that. They're very unexpected. They're in the landscape, and they're pretty much hidden, and they were not performed, right, as performance art with invited audiences, I don't know much about people accidentally chancing upon them, right? And she did have assistance in some cases, but they were documented. And she exhibited from many of her pieces the photographs, the residue, right? The evidence, right? What's left after she leaves the site, right? Because the pieces may, without her body, still be there. Here we have her still working with a silhouette form, which may be a little bit difficult, to make out. But in this particular case, the silhouette had been ignited. So what was left were ashes within this body shape. And she placed a rock, and then she poured tempera paint over it, because what she found is that working with blood on the earth, it was really hard to see the blood. So she would mix often, right, the tempera paint, and it would be much, as you see here, much brighter and easier to see. And then she lays on top of this piece. I don't know if I mentioned, but the siluetas were, at this early part, through most of the 70s, were made from her own body. Like at times at the beginning, her, a companion would come and actually outline her body, and then the rest would happen. It would be filled in, different things would happen if her body wasn't going to remain. Other times, and eventually what I think began to happen is the use of a plywood cutout, which became a lot easier. And you'll see siluetas both with the arms up like this, the tree of life, and then close to the body, as you've already seen. She used the tree of life form a lot, you'll see that, and then stopped using it, and we'll talk about that maybe later. Here's another one of these life, birth, death, regeneration, kinds of experimental pieces. She covered a skeleton, the face and the hands with putty, flesh-colored putty, and some blood paint, and then she lays on top of it. So here's one of the tree of life shaped pieces. So when people talk about her work, they spend a lot of time thinking about the perishability of some of the pieces. She was making work that was, in cases like this, when they were made like on a shore at a beach, or especially an ocean, where they were quickly going to disappear, right, in a matter of hours, as a matter of fact. And she did a lot of work that that would dissolve, right? It would go back, and what would be the trace? And so we could even ask ourselves, what was the point? I think that's what was the point? We'll leave that question kind of hanging. What is it that she brings, to herself or to our attention by making this work that goes through a process? A process absolutely of transformation, as I was saying. But the transformation seems to be, in this case, like dissolution. Like, is it going to totally disappear? Yes, it's going to totally disappear in this case. And so, what is that? What is that about? Some sort of meditation on time, on temporality, on the fleetingness of that which is created, on the transformation of all life forms into different art forms. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways, I think, for us to think about it. And those are some of the things that come into my mind. This is one of the Tree of Life pieces that I think is, along with this piece, right? This also, if you can see, it's a little harder to see that there is a body which is covered with mud and other things that make it seem very much a part of the bark. And you already see that operation here. There's mud, there's little bits of like grass, the figures against the tree. In her notebooks, she did many pieces with trees during this period, and in her notebooks, she observes that the goal is like to also find hollows and shapes that are already in the trees that look human-like. And there's a photograph that of her like fitting into like this dead, still upstanding trunk, trying to fit her body into it as part of like her, her research stage. So in pieces like this, and like this, she's really, I think, begging that question of what is the relationship between human and nature. I think it's absolutely true that we could say that clearly she's making nature seem alive, right? Because that looks like especially this one, looks like a tree trunk that's kind of humanoid, right? Like when you're driving through the woods or walking through the woods and you do a double take, and you're like, oh, what was that? It's not an animal, it's not a human, it's a tree trunk, right? Or some other growth. But those are like really kind of interesting moments, possibly uncanny moments where the similarity is so great and you feel like, wow, the light or my eyes were playing tricks. It really looked like a human or an animal form. And so that kind of like creating that kind of ambiguity or that kind of confusion definitely suggests like that we're anthropomorphizing, right? That we're humanizing, that we're using the human form to possibly suggest that nature is also alive. But I ask myself, what about the other direction, right? What does it mean to place a human, somehow identifiably human within nature, right? And ask it from the other direction too. What does it say when there is an identifiable human body? If we look closely enough, or we can magnify the photograph if we couldn't be there ourselves, you know, what is it, what is it also opening up for us to think about in the other direction? In what way are we also nature in a way that's absolutely literal? We are nature. What does that mean that we are nature? That we are part of a forest, that we are like a tree trunk, you know? So I think that's super interesting work of hers. Here's the more of the Tree of Life series. She was spending a lot of time returning over and over to Mexico and continuing to do different types of experiments there, continuing to study. She was also studying the indigenous cultures that had been either mixed out, or shipped out, or had died through, labor or the conquest of Cuba, and so Mexico becomes a place for her to think about herself as a Latin American and a Latin American of indigenous and African diasporic cultural roots. So she'll continue to return to these places. Here's another one of the pieces that she did in ruins. This one's a little harder to see. It's really just an outline with like flowers and foliage. And again, the question of ephemerality, right? The barely visible, that which will not have a long lifespan. Not only will it not have an audience or much of an audience, except perhaps an accidental tourist or a fellow artist working with her, but meant to not last. And the ruins are also both a marker of what was there that isn't anymore, and the rubble, the remains of something. So we've seen her already working with her Silueta forms on banks, river banks, ocean beaches, on tree trunks, against tree trunks, and now she begins experimenting with fire, gunpowder fire, and here in Mexico, setting the Silueta against the sky. And it's beautifully filmed. At the end of the period, I have some recommendations for you. One of them is a film that we have here at Berkeley, and I don't know if you can get it like on YouTube or something, but it's a beautiful film, and you can actually see the entire sequence of the lighting of this piece and its final extinction. Here, she's working with the gunpowder, outlines, and you see that the figure is also becoming more abstract. 1977. This is, I think, the same picture from the other direction. So here she's already working, she's mounding, the pieces, she's continuing to work with fire, She's creating like enclosures and just exploring. This is also on the riverbank in Iowa where she did a great deal of work, working in, again, in different materials, different times of the year. She even has a piece that she did, a silueta, that is not mounded and is three-dimensional as this piece, but that is also ignited, right? So the fire, the ice together. This is part of the fetish series where she begins to bring other kinds of African diasporic and not just Santeria traditions like Palo Monte, but also just other African traditions that she has familiarized herself from other parts of Latin America, like Brazil, as well as Palo Monte in Cuba, for example. And so it's kind of the fetish, the idea of transferring and receiving energy, right? Using a piece in a ritual fashion. And the background of this piece is that her mother was at this time ill, diagnosed with cancer, and she just explains that she just, it wasn't a real ritual piece, but it was something that she felt like doing, that felt to her like it had some kind of shamanic quality, some kind of healing possibility as an outlet, but also as a channel, and as a way of focusing, power and intention. You see her still concerned. When you look at Palo Monte and other kinds of African or African diasporic spiritual practices, the markings, there's also sacred geometry and sacred markings. And these are partly invented and partly in reference to these kinds of traditions. But I should say one more thing about these kinds of pieces, that I think that they start to show this a more serious interest on her part in the shamanic, in what is it that the artist does, what is it that art might be able to do. And she did believe that the artist, in her own words, that the artist's works irrigated, that the artist's works were like veins of this precious cosmic sap, this ashe, this chi, this life force. So there's a great deal of intentionality in this kind of work, right? And she also wrote that to a friend, that she really felt like that the work that she was doing was shamanic, though she herself was not a registered, initiated shaman, but that she felt like she was maybe some kind of a reincarnation, that she definitely felt that sort of energy, a healing and a powerful energy in the work that she was doing. This is just an example of some of the different kinds of things she filled the siluetas. This is a much more elongated one, filling them with flowers, different kinds of flowers. This is a piece that's really difficult to see, even when you have like the glossy exhibition catalog in front of you. But she used mushrooms on a log to form the silueta, and again, making it really difficult to distinguish the form, the human form, from another natural form. Here you see her continuing to work with the mounded up, built up, and ignited silueta. Here are like the ashes, the remains of a gunpowder piece. So I put these in chronological order so that we get kind of, get, without too much commentary, kind of get a sense of some of the work and how it was progressing. She also worked, as I said before, she worked in water, with mud in the water, with flowers in the water, on rafts, sending siluetas in rafts. And she also worked with algae, and she worked with like these kinds of edges of like sprouting vegetation. Again, very difficult, right, to see, and something that will definitely become incorporated in its environment. One of the things that she began gradually doing, we could see that she's not using the cutout plywood of her form anymore. She begins, and that the forms have gotten elongated, they've gotten, much more like a reference than, a literal marking stamped from her body. She begins to look for natural human-like forms in that she doesn't have to do too much to, just kind of seeing it and altering it. This is also maybe one of her pieces that is seen more. And, the Tree of Life series, we typically think of it, all those pieces as being like with the arms upright. And I think this is a very powerful piece where she has covered herself, right, in muddy clay and settled herself between the vegetation and the roots of a tree on a sort of a hillside. This is one of those pieces where it's very difficult to see where is the Silueta, because the natural formations can be read at least as head and shoulders, and then the rest is something else, some sort of humanoid, kinds of natural formations. So this is one of the pieces that she spent as she made some pieces that were about that were volcanic, that she called volcano pieces, and where she would ignite them and return to them repeatedly. This is one of those pieces where she found a cave and she simply augmented a little bit, right, the shape that was already there, as well as having outlined and ignited a more familiar looking silhouette on the inside. But caves are something that she will also begin to work with in Cuba, as we'll shortly see. So this is 1979. This kind of figure is more familiar to those of you who have looked at like feminist goddess work or simply looked at goddess images. Is like the Venus of Willendorf, right? The large-breasted, large-thighed, kind of short figures. So these goddess. So maybe we can talk later in the Q&A about the feminist movement and its goddess and the spirituality response to patriarchal religion. Here we have Black Venus. This is like an overt reference, right? Black Venus is an overt reference to creation stories and history, right? The legends based on history of the encounter of the Spaniards and Columbus to indigenous women and the resistance of the indigenous woman who is refigured as black and as this kind of mythical goddess figure, right? So the resistance of women in the face of colonization. And she has some writings at this time about colonization and about neo-colonization. So she was thinking as she incorporated non-Western goddesses, and they are specifically goddesses, about the colonization of the Caribbean and the Americas. So I'm nearing, you'll be probably quite relieved to know that I'm nearing the end of these slides. She also then begins to, in 1980, is able to go to Cuba, and 81 goes back to Cuba, and in the early 80s continues going back to Cuba, and then is invited to do a piece. And she begins drawing on leaves. She begins making different kinds of sculptural forms, and in Cuba makes pieces in a park outside of Cuba Haruko, the Steps of Haruko, it's called. And these pieces to me are really striking. When you see the film of this, you see the wind, that is there, and it's kind of, you see the branches swaying, and you really understand how the piece has been, especially after all these years of her making this kind of work, how the piece has been so designed, to become a part, like the caves of Altamira, to become a part of that place, that space, a mark that will become anonymous in time and that will be eroded. There's going to be no preservation, no shellacking, none of this. And yet the figures are named after these Caribbean goddesses, including creation goddesses, instead of like the male figuration of God, a kind of more global, like pagan understanding of creation as genderless, and so sometimes figured as female or female and male simultaneously. See the goddess of the wind. First woman, right? The creator. So you see the work is actually becoming more sculptural in the Rupestrian pieces. This was the longest video in the exhibition here. It was really long and it had sound, I think unlike the others. And it was this piece that was, as you see, open-ended and on the shore facing Cuba. I think it kind of speaks for itself. This piece, Isla, is also a piece that people have commented on in interesting ways. So Isla makes us think, of course, about her island, but it also is shaped like a woman, right? And so some feminist critics have thought about what does that mean, that this thinking of island and woman. Is there something there about the isolation, right, of, in this case, not just humans, which is something that she thought about, the isolation of being human, again, the topic of being an orphan, a cosmic orphan, of exile being, yes, about real exile from Cuba, but also being about the human condition. In a piece like this, she goes back to thinking about what difference gendering has to do with that, or might make there. So I'm just moving through these. This would be, again, so easy to mistake as a natural form. So I was saying she did the body tracks, even at the end of her, towards the end of her life. So here we have another of these. This was a piece that was made to be permanent and could be ignited in a permanent way by the people who commissioned it. This is already like a sculptural form. Arbitra, I think the name on that is interesting, given that she didn't do, well, it's interesting in itself, but also she didn't do a lot of naming. So witness, difficult to see, but the form is outlined in white. We'll get a better view. Here the figures are becoming, you can definitely see that a sculptural, more abstract and very beautiful form is emerging in her work. And those were floor sculptures that she made. This piece is over at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And we end with this image. These were some of the 7-foot sculptures that she made with the help of a specialist, a craftsperson. She burned, like, as in like branding, figures on 3 of these pieces, stumps. Okay, so that was that. I welcome any questions or, any fleshing out, of any of the things that I mentioned, and any of your own comments about these pieces. And there could be questions as well that connect this work to what you've already been thinking about, feminist issues, or, the people of color issue, or the decolonial issue, or the issue of identity and essentialism, I don't know, whatever. Happy to receive any of your questions or your comments. And there are 2 people, I think, walking around with microphones. So there's a question up front. Oh yeah, I was going to go back to that. Yeah, I'm sorry. She fell out of a window, 34th or 35th floor in New York City. She Her husband, who is a well-known and still living sculptor, Carl Andre, a minimalist sculptor, was actually indicted, and however that was overturned. And so people have documented and written about the very, very suspicious circumstances. It was clear that they had been fighting. He was described as a violent person. She was described as a person whose career was soaring, a person who was not prone to depression or suicide. A person who was very happy with her work. And so her friends and her family and feminist art critics really do not believe that it was an accident. And one of the things that was especially offensive in one of the trial proceedings was the suggestion by Andre's lawyers that maybe it was that like Santeria stuff that she was involved in, that kind of black magic stuff. Maybe she got possessed and, was flung out of the window. So that's like a really like incredibly like racist and cheeky, right, form of defense. So it really added salt to the wounds of her friends and her family and her community who still expect there to be justice. There's a title that, there's a title, so I have some sources for you here. There's a title of a book, Where is Ana Mendieta? And there was a big art show at the Whitney Art Museum somewhat after her death. And Carl Andre was in that show, but Ana Mendieta was not. And so the feminist art community, gathered there and protested. And that was their question, where is Ana Mendieta? Which, excuse me, reminds me of pieces that were made in the Southern Cone, and that actually that strategy continues to be used in the Southern Cone in Argentina, in Paraguay, in Uruguay. Mothers would gather with photographs of their children and say, where is my son, where is my daughter, by name. In the face of military governments, military dictatorships that had, quote unquote, disappeared their children. So the language of disappearance, came forward as a strategy by government. We don't know. We haven't seen them. No one has seen them. They were just snatched in the middle of the night in a dark vehicle. They've disappeared. So even the word the disappeared, right, became very important, and people talk about the disappeared and counter with appearance, counter with pictures, counter with words. And so something similar, where is Ana Mendieta, right? Ruby Rich wrote about it in 1 year after she died, and had a lot of details in the Village Voice. Yes? Yes.
Like Tree of Life images like gave me like Blair Witch Project vibes. But my question is, when you showed us the first like chicken piece,
Yeah.
I was wondering what did Anna do with the blood after like the chicken was beheaded? Since you had mentioned that that was one of the life energy, that was one carrier of that.
The blood of the chicken, somebody helped her chop the head of the chicken and then gave her the chicken with the squirting blood, and she squirted that, allowed that to squirt on her body. I don't know if she recycled the chicken. I don't know what happened to that. Yes.
I'm just interested because some of her works were like very private, like these temporary, sculptures that were off in the wild somewhere that no one would really come across other than if she decided to share pictures of them.
Right.
And then some of her other works were sort of like public spectacle, like the one of the blood coming out from underneath the door. So I was wondering if you could talk about her relationship with like an audience and what she was interested in with that.
I think that one of the reasons why her work is not like classified, right? If we have to classify into genre, is performance art, is because even though performance art is also ephemeral, right? You'll see a piece, and yeah, maybe you can document it, but it's the piece. You're performing it, you're there, and your audience is there and in real time. And that became less and less important to her. She does have some notes about how what she liked about performance art was that it focused on experience, you know. But I think she was interested in showing the work. Her first show were photographs, right? And then later shows she tried to actually reproduce within a gallery space siluetas. Well, she actually did. She tried. And then, in more public spaces, she would make siluetas, trees on the lawn, etc. So I do think that it seems that for a long period, for maybe like a 10-year chunk, right, from the early 70s to the beginning of the 80s, that the question of audience is mediated, right? It is about reaching an audience, but not necessarily in the immediate, right, experience or presence, but experiencing it through something that is not it, but that points to something that happened somewhere that is different, right? So, so I think that we can think about that as in probably a number of ways, but one way that I've thought about that is that it's all about like these traces. It's about this this space in between what is present and what is absent, right? So working both with the documentation of something that happened, a presence, and yet clearly it's absent at that moment, right? And it's also going to be absent increasingly as it erodes. So not sure more than that, Yeah, interesting. Any thoughts? Do you have any thoughts about, audience? What it makes you, or anyone else? Because I think that is a really good question. How this work is working with an audience, or someday for an audience, or yes.
The question just is about the role of photography
Yeah.
in your work.
Yeah.
Because what we see are photographs.
Right.
And I just would like to hear you talk about the role of photography.
Well, there's stills from Super 8 films, and she chose
Right.
not to use video, which is another question I had too.
She used at the very beginning and at the very end. She used a little bit of video, but primarily Super 8 film. She took a great deal of the photographs herself. She also had friends and fellow artists that took photographs or were also making films. Some of the films she set up like on a tripod, right? So it was clearly a really important medium for her, and I think that we talk less, like when you read the literature, we do talk less about that what we're looking at is a photograph and not just a documentation, right, of a earth work, right, a performance earth sculptural work. It was definitely, she shaped and framed what it was that she wanted pictured, right, what it was that she wanted shown, and captured. So it was an integral part of her work. It was absolutely an integral part of her work.
But she may not have been
Also that time we always used the Super 8. And also that time, I was only at 1976.
Yeah.
The Art Institute. But 1976, we still had a passion to do that body work. So I think you can take that in to the account.
Yes.
Because it was, most students did that.
Yeah.
Also fireworks, it's very familiar.
Yes.
And 8mm we always used to make a video.
Yeah, that's very useful. Yeah, you can look at other artists' work of that time experimenting, right, with those different media. We do have like early films and like early photographs where she's actually experimenting with the film itself, like, and I've seen other artists do that too, like scratching, painting, on the film. So I think it was another one of the media that she did study and take seriously, in the intermedia arts program that she was in, where they were studying a variety of media, including film, and I guess to a lesser degree video. I'm not sure why she didn't use video. I wonder if it was more expensive at that time than Super 8. I'm not sure. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I don't know. I don't know if she ever used her own blood. She may have. I don't know. I know that she used animal blood. Yeah, and I'm not sure where she got that. I'm assuming she got it from a slaughterhouse or a butcher or something like this. Yeah. Good. Okay. You're welcome. Yeah. Thank you.